We live in an age of anxiety, confusion, and turmoil. We have a sense that we're sitting on a powder keg, one small match, and kaboom. Leaders feel bombarded by interest groups and agitators, and when institutions fall prey to the spirit of appeasement, paralysis, and excuse-making, the most mature and motivated members begin to quietly drift away. My hope and prayer is that God will use this simple course to encourage and strengthen Christian leaders so that we rebuild the walls of Christendom and show forth the excellencies of the living God in the joy and gladness of our families, our churches, our schools, and our communities. And welcome to Doug Wilson and Friends.
And Friends.
This is Doug.
Here's Mark and Avoid.
Man. Slammed it. He planned that one coming in.
How long did you work on that?
I'm Joe Rigney. This is Dr. Jared Longshore. And with us today, Andrew Isker, pastor from Minnesota, and otherwise known as Boniface Option.
Yes.
So we're very excited to be with you today in this still no quarter November. Wanted to remind you, as the bumper showed you on the lead-in there, new course at canonplus.com, Leadership in an Age of Anxiety. Essentially, for years, I've been recommending Edwin Friedman's Failure of Nerve as a book on leadership that I think gets a lot right. But it's not a Christian book, and so this course is an attempt to root Friedman's insights in biblical soil and then apply them in the home, the church, and the world. So if you want to take a look at that, join canonplus.com, and you can sign up for Canon Plus and get that course along with many other resources. It is no quarter November, which means we love to give away books. This week, Al Carlson's American Way is the free book, as well as Becca Merkel's Eve in Exile. So if you want to get those, check those out, noquarternovember.com. And even more importantly, running with that Eve in Exile theme, tomorrow, beginning tomorrow, Thursday through Saturday, the documentary Eve in Exile will be available for free on Twitter. So if you got friends who've never seen that, don't know if they want to sign up for Canon Plus, this would be a great chance to get them the little sampler by seeing Eve in Exile on Twitter for free. And then last but not least, we have a new book release today. It's called American Milk and Honey: Anti-Semitism, the Promise of Deuteronomy, and the True Israel of God by Doug Wilson. So, Doug, what's that book all about?
I forget.
Is it relevant? Does it have any relevance for anything happening?
Yes, it does. And it's almost like a higher power at work because this book was in the works for a long time, many months, and it started to converge on this moment. And then the Hamas-Israel thing blew up right at the time that this was being released. So everybody's talking about Israel. And there's a lot of confusion in Christians' minds about our relationship with the Jews, particularly because American Christianity, evangelical Christianity, is so dispensational.
Right.
And dispensationalism has a unique spot for the Jews and in their eschatological program. And that drives support for Israel, but there's a weird complication in it because in their theology it's support for Israel to set them up for Armageddon.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes the Israelis pick up on that. Like,
right.
wait, why are you in our corner?
Yeah. Well, and we're not dispensationalists. We're Reformed, and so what is our take on this? And then in the dispensational world, a lot of people throw around the term supersession, which is basically the supersessionist is the person who believes that the church is Israel now. So the Reformed faith is supersessionist.
Right.
Right. I don't think there's some dispensationalists talk as though God has two peoples of God.
Right.
And this kind is saved by law and keeping the Torah, and this kind is saved by grace. And that sort of lends itself to all kinds of confusion. And so we think that supersessionism is the only biblical option, but there is a distinction between hard supersessionism. Israel is nothing now. They're just, well, not nothing. They're nothing in the purposes,
Covenantal
and plans
purposes
of God.
or anything like that.
They're just like the Hittites or the Armenians or the Italians. They're just another group, but no special promises attached. That would be hard supersessionism. And then there would be soft supersessionism, which holds that the church is Israel now, but that God has reserved a spot for the Jews to come back in, Romans 11. So a lot hinges on how you take the olive tree prophecy in Romans 11.
Right.
And so this book, so to even raise these questions, raises about 101 other questions.
Right.
Right. So this book attempts to address the promises of Deuteronomy. Who are those promises for? Are the Jews going to come back into the Christian faith? What will that look like when they do? Yep. How are we? Who is the true Israel of God? Yep. And then how are we to understand the problematic nature of anti-Semitism? Yep. Why is it so virulent?
Yeah.
So we
not just now, but historically, all through history, this has been a common thing.
Over centuries.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have been astonished over the last few weeks by the pro-Hamas rallies, largely driven by the commies. Yeah. But there's more than a little bit of that on the right wing also. So what I try to do in this book is define anti-Semitism, put it in the historical context, give a reformed take on Romans 11. Mm-hmm. What's the classic Reformed take on Romans 11? Right. So that's what it's about.
So you're getting history, you're getting theology, biblical studies, and sort of geopolitics. How does this all shake out in terms of our own postures today?
Correct.
Right.
All of that.
Okay.
So
good. That leads into a nice topic right here at the outset. So Andrew, would you be a hard supersessionist based on how Doug just laid that out? Would that be your?
Yeah, I've never used that term, but I mean the categories that he's setting up. Yeah, I would say so. My view of Romans 11 is different. It's the a preterist, partial preterist view of, especially Paul uses the phrase present time about Israel in that time, and so I take it as meaning this conversion happened before 70 AD, and that there was a mass conversion of Jews in Judea and around Jerusalem before the hammer came down and Jerusalem was destroyed.
Which means then that the Jews after that, so rabbinic Judaism into the Middle Ages, into European Jews, and then now the state of Israel is a different animal.
Yeah,
there's
not a linkage between Old Covenant Israel and
that people group
and Talmudic Judaism.
In that view, then the question would be, when were these unbelieving Jews cut out? Mm-hmm. So it's a very narrow window you've got there where Paul dies in the 60s, right? And he's still preaching to the Jews. So you have, if he ever got out to Spain, he'd go to the synagogue first.
Of course, yeah.
Right? And but they're not cut out yet. They're
well, I think they're being cut. I think they're being cut out throughout the apostolic age. I mean, they're cutting themselves out, right? Persecuting the church, persecuting the apostles, and so forth. And
that's why it's a partial hardening, right? It's a partial hardening has come upon Israel in that era.
Yeah, and I'm actually preaching on the Book of Acts right now, and you can see it, right? When they bring the apostles into the Sanhedrin and they scourge them, and all of the conflict that happens throughout that entire period. Well, that's them saying, right? We're not with Jesus. We're with our conception of the law and the traditions of the fathers.
Now, how just to pursue this a little bit, I can see interacting with a hard supersession. This is my terminology, but a hard supersessionist who is not anti-Semitic at all. He's just this is his doctrinal position,
right?
But in the online world, I see a lot of what I would call an anti-Semitic vibe coming off of people who utilize hard supersessionist.
Yeah, it's like a fig leaf.
It's a fig leaf. Yeah, I'm just making a point about Romans 11. And then all the bile comes out, and part of this is a blow. I'm not saying this because my feelings are hurt, but just saying I'm arguing for a soft supersessionist view, and a lot of these people, right-wing trolls, are attacking me Right.
Yeah. Even though like a dispensationalist would see what you're saying, your eschatological position and so forth, as being anti-Semitic, right? That's always the
right. Any
slogan.
supersessionism
Any
Replacement
supersessionism.
theology. You hate Jews, you know, and so no, I get that, and you know, I think, I mean, some of it is the difficulty is if with the soft supersessionism, it can almost sound like to some people the same thing as dispensationalism, where, oh, there is this separated people that have to continue existing for all time, or else the Bible's not true, right? And so, you know, my view is, right, they could all convert, you know, in the next 100 years, and the history will keep on going. I mean,
And if you're post-mill, you think they will.
And I'm post-mill, so I think they're going to, or if they disappear as a particular people, whoever their descendants are, and whatever they are, will come to Christ.
Right.
But no eschatology or no future events hinge on that happening for them particularly.
It wouldn't be a prophetic fulfillment.
Yeah,
Right.
and so I look at it as actually something that should encourage less of it, just like supersessionism I think does, where it's now they're not these very special people that we have to hold up high. They're regular people that need Jesus, right? That should be the perspective.
So go ahead.
Yeah. Well, do you think so? Do you think that there's a particular animus that's like people don't tend to the kind of bile, use the word bile a second ago, that's directed at the Zionist, you know, the Zionist filth, or the bootlickers who support the Zionists and that sort of thing, seems to have a different kind of quality to it compared to what people feel about, say, Italians and Swedes. Or, you know, whoever. So,
Well,
like,
I don't know about the Swedes.
Yeah, the Swedes. We have, yeah, there's
Part Swedish. So
yeah, there you go. Very good.
Sorry.
that's right.
But do you think that there's a particular that anti-Semitic vibe that kind of lurks in certain parts of the internet? What do you think? What is that? How would you categorize that? And how do you push back against it? How do you navigate dealing with that?
I think a lot of it is due to the fact that within our current cultural and political dispensation, you can't, you know, just even address things honestly and look at, okay, well, there happen to be a lot of you know, people of that ethno-religious background that are in high positions of political and cultural and economic power, and even addressing it academically, not with animus or anything like that, to be able to say, oh, I wonder why they pursue these particular policy ends or why they make movies this way. You know, you're not allowed to talk about those things, right? You will be destroyed. Your life will be over if you do. And so, like within that kind of paradigm, right? Then what happens is people, right? I mean, it's kind of like COVID when everybody is locked in their homes and they're not able to go out and do anything. Like, it made a lot of people angry, and so they're penned up. And so it's similar to that, where if you're not allowed to honestly and openly discuss things freely, right? Then people will come unglued.
I'm gonna talk about these things even harder.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah,
Right.
yeah, exactly.
But here's the catch on that, because I've run into that an awful lot in my interactions online. Someone just a week or so ago wondered online in Twitter very darkly who had paid for our recent trip to Israel. And,
That's right.
and
Did the Mossad pay for you? You know?
had I met with any Zionists while I was there, and when I talked to people,
Did you?
Yeah, you're not answering the question.
I don't know. so when people bring up the Bolsheviks in Russia, a bunch of Jews, so they point to the Jews who were involved in various dirty deeds down through
Revolutionary activity.
revolutionary activity, the Bolsheviks and
the commies today, all that kind of stuff.
pornographers. You know, so people
like
say,
that,
look at all these bad deeds. We're not allowed to talk about it. Well, I talk about it in this book. You know, so in this book,
good.
I talk about it. But what I do, and this is where it matters to me. My basic argument is that the Jews, taken as a whole, are a high performance people. For whatever reason, their emphasis on education, family cohesion, high expectations, Jews are high-performance people. And it shows up in the patents they get. It shows up in the companies they start. It shows up in Nobel Prizes.
Yeah.
You know, they're less than 1% of the world's population. And they have this outsized influence on all kinds of things. So if you have a high-performance people, when they're good, they're very, very good. And when they're bad, they're very, very bad. So if you have a twins, high performance, and one goes into the mafia, and the other one becomes a brain surgeon, the one does an awful lot of good, and the other does an awful lot of bad. And when I'm talking to people that I would think are anti-Semitic, they say, "Look at these bad guys," and I say, "Yeah, I grant that. I'm not. A bunch of the Bolsheviks were Jews. Yes, they did a lot of damage. A lot of the left-wing nonsense in our country now is supported by Jews, driven by Jews. Okay, all of that.
Including even the like pro-Hamas stuff. I mean, I don't know if you noticed that, but there's a large element of like far-left Jewish people in it. It's like, wow, that doesn't make any sense, does it?
Doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
But so I grant all that. So that argument goes away. And then I say to them, and now can you acknowledge all their contributions to heart surgery and all their contributions to Philharmonic orchestras, the first violin, and it goes dead quiet. They do not want to admit all the positive contributions.
Yeah, I want these people to be Christians for that reason. You know?
Well, I would say a philo-Semite would be someone who only talks about the positive contributions and then tries to cancel you if you point out all the negative ones. And if you point out the negative ones, but you will not refer to the positive ones, then that's what I would call an anti-Semite, right? So if I say, okay, yeah, a lot of bad stuff, and here's a bunch of good stuff, why is that so hard? You know,
do you think though, one of the things that, and I do this too, where I in conversation with people that are of this perspective, right, and they notice that much of the secular movement in America and just the push to secularism in America over the last 100 years, and it makes sense. Like if you, I don't want to use the word empathy with Joe here, but like if you put yourself in their shoes,
please
right?
don't.
That's right. You put yourself in their shoes, and you're thinking as a group of people who are have for hundreds, thousands of years been on the outside of European Christian society, and you're thinking from like a group identity perspective, you would want there to be secularism because it's good for your people. So it makes sense that
you could join.
They would push that.
You could. A Jew can more readily get into country clubs. In a secular society than in a Christianized one.
Yeah. So I even instead of and so like even having the conversation like that, which is not really allowed anywhere else, I think it helps people to not be so angry and not be as conspiratorial, because I think you look at it, it's like, well, it makes sense if you're looking at it from a perspective of what's good for my people. Well, you would push a secular society, so
one of the things I do in this book is, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to talk.
Yeah, glad to do it.
We're going to talk about my book.
We're getting there. We're getting there.
So I have a chapter on the Talmud, 2 chapters on the Talmud. One of them is all the horrific stuff that's in there. There's some really bad stuff.
Yeah, Jesus boiling in feces in hell. Yeah, stuff like that.
Well, stuff like that, and when it's okay to molest a kid. And, there's really bad stuff.
Really bad, yeah.
But then I have another chapter on all the wonderful stuff in the Talmud. So the Talmud is sort of like someone collected cosmopolitan articles over the course of 500 years and bound them in a volume. And some of them are from the late 1800s on how to can your own peaches. And some of them are 88,000 ways to drive your man crazy in bed. And you've got this wide... And the problem that all Jews have is the place of veneration they give to the whole Talmud, because it's this big thing that is just sitting there and people don't really know. But it has this position of authority. And there's some wonderful stuff in there. There's also some really bad stuff. So it seems to me that interest of truth would just be able to point to both and say, this is real from a Christian perspective. This is really bad. this is really good.
I do think even just at that, there's a basic point there that I think a lot of Christians miss. I think this is the fruit of the sort of dispensational undercurrent of a lot of evangelicalism. But when I was in college, I took a Bible is lit class at a secular university, and it was taught by an Orthodox Jew. And in the first class, and so this is Old Testament Bible is literature. And the thing that he wanted, he had a lot of Christians come through that class because it was a Bible class. But one of the things he pointed out was that the Old Testament is a necessary foundation of two modern religions, Christianity and Judaism, but it's the sufficient foundation of neither. So Christians read their Old Testament through the New Testament. They read it through Christ, and Christ is the filter. But Jews do the same thing through the Talmud. The Talmud is their New Testament, and it's just a gnarly, weird one. It has that mixed bag. But his point was nobody is doing Old Testament religion anymore. That's gone. It's done. Nobody's sacrificing anything. A lot of the laws are reinterpreted in various kind of creative ways. It's a very weird conglomeration that's been passed down through the centuries. But it's important, I think, to get that in that sense. Modern Jews and Christians are in a similar place relative to the Old Testament, and it's not simply the case that they're sort of Old Covenant people still around today.
Yeah, it's important.
Nobody's doing the Old Testament today until the red heifer is born.
Until the red heifer is born, and then that temple.
Next year.
Next year.
Maybe a question I had for you, Andrew. You said the Jews, it's better now in this view you were talking about because they're not the special people anymore. They're just like kind of one among many of the nations. Do you take the Jews to have what kind of connectivity do they have to the Old Testament Israelites?
Well, you mean in terms of like genetics or spiritually or
Classification of people. Like, I mean, would you say that this is the same general people that we have in the Old?
No, it's I don't know if I would. I mean, it's interesting. I saw a series of like genetic studies, for instance, a couple weeks ago, and it took somehow they're able to figure out Israelite DNA and be able to take all of the modern people groups that exist today and collect it. Okay, who has the most? And the group, you want to guess the group that has the most Israelite DNA?
Swedes, probably.
No, it's a good guess. Palestinian Christians. Palestinian Christians have the most Israelite DNA. And then all the different Levantine Christians have the most, and then the various, like the Druze and the Karaites and people like that. Way further down the list is Ashkenazi Jews. And so I think that's somewhat interesting. I mean, it's even though I know so many of the arguments, especially the dispensational arguments, don't rely on necessarily genetics.
Right.
But it's
so at that point, it gets into what is a people, what counts as a people, and is it mainly biology and genetics, or is it sort of cultural traditions and identification with shared history, shared narrative, shared customs, and things like that. So in that sense, wouldn't there be that's the continuity that I think you might see between first century or 10th century.
I would go even further. When Abraham went to war to retrieve Lot, after, he had 318 fighting men with him. When Abraham was circumcised and his whole household was circumcised,
they were as well.
They were as well, his fighting men. But what the Navy would call plank owners, the people who were on the ground floor of Judaism, Abraham's household, 90% of them didn't have Abraham's DNA
whatsoever.
Right.
It's not a DNA thing. It goes back to what I would say an ethnicity has to do with language, customs, laws, shared heritage, group identity,
shared attachment to land.
And so, if someone proved to me that the Ashkenazi Jews were all
were 0%,
it was 0%. I would say it doesn't matter. Doesn't matter because they are covenantally bound to this. I would argue the covenant of Hagar in Galatians. So covenantally they are Ishmaelites because they are they've identified with this line that goes all the way back, and it goes back through the disputes with Jesus, Jesus and Paul.
Yeah,
It's so grant that there is that kind of connection.
I'm
thinking then what is like the Christian take on the people that still have this particular tie? Like When we read about Old Testament Israel, does the Christian's heart go, boy, I love that people? Or does the Christian's heart say, like, man, these covenant breaking people that are worthy of destruction?
I think the Christian's heart should be, I'm united to that people that I read about in the Old Testament through Jesus, right? And not even really think about these other people, especially because, I mean, you look at it, and this I think goes into like the Romans 11 preterist view that they're coming to arrest me.
Arrest you or rescue you?
We'll find out.
You know, you have under Abraham, I mean, each time the covenant, as the covenant moves forward throughout history, you have a different name for the people of God, right? You have Hebrews and then Israelites, and then after the exile, they're all called Jews, even though they're not all descended from the tribe of Judah. And then as the new covenant comes in, now you have Christians, right? This is the name for the people of God. And so, you know, the people that are cut out and who reject Christ, right? They don't have that name anymore. That name of Jew in the biblical sense doesn't exist in the same way, right? They're a different kind of people.
So why? I guess this goes back to Joe's question. Why do they draw so much hatred?
That's a good question. I just want to. We're built on the foundation of the prophets and the apostles, right? Mm-hmm. I just want to make.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, they were Jews.
Yeah, of course.
Like foundation.
Yeah.
Like we stand on them.
Yeah, but I think part of Andrew's point is that the modern people group that goes by the name Jew doesn't have any covenantal ties.
That's not the biblical name for the people of God. I mean, they're using that name, but it would be like, I mean, it's like the black Hebrew Israelites calling themselves Hebrews.
Yeah, so
right?
It does seem like the issue was the issue about the blood tests versus any kind of covenantal
identification.
Any kind of covenant.
I think the old covenant is done in 70 AD, and so there isn't any particular covenant.
Do you think
that
the
remains.
covenant with Hagar is done in 70 AD?
Yeah, I think so. I think when Paul's discussing this, I think it comes to a close. I think that that section of Galatians is, I mean, you read it in tandem with Romans 11 and the olive tree, right? And so I look at it that way.
Well, so if Galatians is written in the 40s and Jerusalem falls in 70 AD, that's less than 30 years to have this covenant.
Well, I mean, would Paul say that the apostate Israelites in 1 Kings, right, that are worshiping Baal, right? Which covenant are they in? Are they in the covenant with Abraham, or are they in the covenant with Hagar? Right?
Yeah,
would you apply it anachronistically, right? And I think it's a paradigm that he's offering between the two, and he's making the argument that no, the promise belongs to those who have the faith of Abraham, which is in Christ.
On the promise, all supersessionists would agree that the promise is to Abraham and to a seed, and that is apprehended by faith through Christ. So all Reformed Christians are supersessionists. Yeah. It's not like they think Christians are going to heaven and Jews are going to heaven on the back of the bus.
Yeah, that's right.
Although some dispensationalists sometimes talk that way.
Go down that road.
Or like there's two buses. There's some of that. But we would agree with all the supersessionist points. The people of God today, the church, is Israel now.
Which means, just like tie this to something, this is, again, for broadly evangelical audience. Oftentimes, I remember growing up even in kind of dispensational circles where, why should the United States support Israel? Because God said, I'll bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you. Yeah. And so as long as the U.S. stands by Israel, we'll receive the blessing of God. If we ever turn our back on Israel, then God will turn his back on us. And that's a misapplication, because the people of God that everybody ought to be worried about is the Christian church. The Christian church is the one. If you bless the Christian church, then God will bless you. Right. If you persecute in the Christian church, then God's going to curse you as a nation. And so that Abrahamic promise belongs to us.
On biblical terms, the Jews don't have a promise of the land apart from returning to the Lord. You return to the Lord first. And then we can talk about land.
So
geopolitical support for Israel would have to be just simply political,
Right.
not
Yeah.
not eschatological, not
Right.
field.
It's all realpolitik, like what makes sense
Yeah,
from
there's
American
millions
interests.
of people living there now. What's the best humanitarian thing we can do,
Yeah.
given this mess that's there? But it seems odd to me, or just a quirk, that you have this category of a covenant with Hagar that is just so short-lived. And so if I say that, no, God keeps the Jews because the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable, not irrevocable doesn't mean 15 more years.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
Irrevocable means they're irrevocable. And they're beloved on account of the patriarchs. I would say, well, they're out. They're cut out of the olive tree, but we should pray for their return. And this is the historic Reformed understanding, right? Is the non-preterist view of Romans 11 that the Jews will be grafted back in, and when that happens, it's the key to world evangelization. That's the Puritan hope.
Yeah. What? I guess my question would be if there was, and there's varying historical accounts about conversions of Jews even after Jerusalem's destroyed, and even after that, many of the Jews that survived right, convert to Christianity.
That's true.
And a vast majority of them, right, very small remnant that retained any semblance of the oral traditions and so forth. And so I look at that. I mean, that group continues on, and maybe it's a random happenstance of history that they continue on in this post-Christian or post-incarnational heretical cult, right? And that's, I think that's the way I sort of look at Judaism in general today. Is not, it's sort of like Joe was saying, right? That they have the Old Testament, but their New Testament's the Talmud, right? And that's how the lens they view it through. And so sort of in those terms, but I'd look at it in the same way that, well, there's all sorts of post-Christian heretical cults that develop in after Christianity comes, like Islam and Mormonism and Arianism, things like that. Would you look at it those way in that way?
I would say that it's a serious rejection of the Messiah and doctrinally off. And there's a chapter on all of this. The Talmud is cockeyed in its rejection of Christ as rejection of Christ as the Christ. But the thing that I keep coming back to is Jehovah's Witnesses are Arian and deny the deity of Christ, and no Christian group that I know of gets any kind of whipped up about them. But if I say anything about Jews online, let's say something like Israel has the right to defend itself against Hamas, something like that. All the puppies and kittens come out to play. And for people who don't think Israel is special, they sure act like it's special, right?
Well, some of it is, some of it you have to think maybe is the antithesis that, many people are raised their entire lives in like especially, southern, southeast part of the country in dispensationalism.
No, I'm not talking about the disagreement.
No. But I mean,
I'm talking about the hatred.
Yeah, when you're in that. Within that world, and then suddenly you realize this is not the way it is. It's very easy to go the opposite direction.
So you're saying it's reactionary.
Yeah,
there's a reactionary element to it.
There's a reactionary element to it, and I mean, what would you say about? I mean, some of the stuff that we talked about, like there are groups, very far left Jewish people that are a major part of the secularist onslaught. And so I don't think of it as monolithic or that it's this massive Jewish conspiracy or things like that.
Right.
But I think they definitely play a role in it because their fundamental identity, even if they're not, they don't have a religious faith whatsoever. Even if they're atheists, they still have this Jewish identity, right? And at the core of their identity is we are not Christian, right? And so I think some of that has to drive.
Well, we are not Christian. and that's why we should be the best brain surgeons.
Or casino owners or brothel owners,
Well, yeah.
things like that. You know, like,
So if you, for whatever quirky reason, if you do have a population that's teeny tiny, and they have an outsized impact, I mean,
Punch above their weight class.
what's that?
They punch above their weight class.
Way above their weight class. You need to account for that somehow.
Yeah, do you think it's, because I know you've written before about, well, it's people that are just envious of of what they have. What if it's not envy? Right. What if it's not
Then I'm a
envy about running Hollywood and things like that? You know, like it's like I don't want to run Hollywood. But what if it's not envy, but it's more so you see, I mean, even looking at. I'm sure you all remember Stephen Wolf's infamous tweet and the subtext of it, which is white evangelicals vote at like 80% for the GOP and things like that. But
the lone bulwark,
and like the mirror image of that is, and obviously it's a much smaller chunk of the population, but is American Jews is like 80% Democrat, right? And so,
but 80% of less than 1% is not the same thing as 80% of millions and millions.
Yeah, but if they're much higher in terms of influence and power and wealth and so forth.
Oh yeah, but see, that's my point. I grant all of that, and when they use their influence and power for secularism, it's really bad.
Yeah.
But when they use,
that's what they've done, though. you know, so like so some of it is, I think people aren't allowed to say that. Right,
no,
they have to do that.
They're allowed to say that as long as they also say, but you got to hand it to them on these cures for cancer that they keep coming up with.
Maybe. I think my question on it would be.
I don't know if you are. I don't know if you. I don't know. There's a fig
my book
leaf
is going to be a test case. So you could do pull quotes out of my book. And make me a raving
people will,
and they will.
But
both sides.
Both sides. There'll be people who say, "Here's a Philo-Semite to beat the band." A Zionist, a fellow traveler, etc.
What do you think's gained? What do you think the net gain is if it's here's saying the nefarious Jews versus just the nefarious people? Like what? Like in other words, if the evil, if the communism, if the high-handed wickedness, if all of this the corruption, if that's the thing that we're most opposed to, what? Because it seems like the thing that gets everybody's dander up is when you say. And it's because they're Jews too. That's the sort of thing, as opposed to I don't like their ethnicity and their heritage or the customs they identify with, or what holidays they celebrate. Is it Christmas or Hanukkah? Like that seems to me largely irrelevant to they're just pursuing godless wickedness, and I don't care about whether they're Jews or not. Like why is that the?
I think if there's a group identity and like ethno-religious motivation behind it, I think it's like looking at a crime scene and you're trying to figure out, okay, what motivated the killer, right, to do this thing. And so I think you should be honest, like, okay, if someone's particular group identity and ethnic identity is driving the things that they do, that plays a role.
But that's Woodrow Wilson and his Anglo-Saxonness.
And
Margaret Sanger and her
the white man's burden, all of that sort of stuff has the same.
So if I said Woodrow Wilson wrecked the 20th century, which he did. Okay.
And he was not Jewish at all.
I'd say, and he was Anglo-Saxon.
And
I'd say, well, what does that have to do with it?
It's a good. I mean, it's a fair point, but at the same time, it isn't. It isn't necessarily as Anglo-Saxon driving it, right? Driving, getting the United States into World War II.
But no, it absolutely was. All right, so the WASP, the whole WASP
establishment,
WASP establishment was white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and that was the establishment. That was the elite. Those were the people who owned the world. They were going to tell the world how to behave, teach the world how to behave. They're going to make the world safe for democracy. And he wrecked the 20th century without any Jewish help.
I mean, how much of the banking interest that drove America to World War I, played a role in that too. It certainly did. I mean, J.P. Morgan and the Rothschilds, like this, that's part of it as well. So it's not totally.
In other words, what we're driving toward, I think, a consensus. Romans 1, the Gentiles are big fat sinners. Romans 2, the Jews are big fat sinners. Romans 3, everybody's a big fat sinner.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, even when we get into discussions of the left and all of that, I often tell people, okay, if this group of people that I think are driven by a particular ethno-religious identity, and that drives their ideology and their thinking and their revolutionary views, if they didn't exist, would the left still exist today and be doing the things that it's doing? Of course.
Yeah.
Of course they would. But at the same time, I don't think we should shy away from it, especially because these are things you're not allowed to talk about and discuss.
I will grant you this: when you attempts to shut people down, ruin people's lives, if they say something unpopular or say something that's not politically correct, that has generated blowback, and people are saying, so if you're gonna wreck my career over 3 microaggressions that got reported to HR, I'm going to go online and read a bunch of material that's going to make you really hopping mad. And that there is that blowback element.
Absolutely. Right.
And that's why I've repeatedly said on my blog that all this ethno-hatred and this racial animosity, not racial, but ethnic animosity and all that we're dealing with, I would lay at the feet of the left because they have cultivated critical race theory. They've taught everybody to think in terms of color swatches and background and what's your identity, and it's polarizing. And now the chickens are coming home to roost. So I don't think we should blame the right-wing fever swamps for that.
I'd like to talk about solution in a minute, but I do have one more question to diagnose the problem. So I've got solution in my head. But first, one more question about diagnosing the problem. If we're finding, and you can tell me this could be your personal position, but I'd also be interested in what people think around this little table here about, say, a soft anti-Semite. Okay, the question is there any relationship, whatever, between the Jews that are the body that we're anti, and the Bible? Meaning, if somebody came out and said, man, I don't like the Jews, and these guys killed Jesus, the first response is somebody that isn't anti-Semitic would say, dude, what are you talking about? These people that we're against have nothing to do with those people at all. Right. Covenantally, ethnically. What are you even talking about? You can't say that. That's one anti-Semite. The other anti-Semite goes, yeah, you're right. Yeah, there is a relationship. Okay, so let's talk about the problem.
And that's the only one
well, not the only one, but just a one. I'm just interested to know, is your own position that there is like no connection whatever between the Jews today and the people of old, or is there some?
No, I don't think there is other than, I mean, it would be like asking the question, right? The guy who LARPs in the woods with a Thor's hammer, is there a connection between him and my ancestors that converted to Christianity?
He's LARPing, so
no. Is there a connection between the two? And I don't think there is.
Well, suppose they've been speaking Old Swedish in his family and literate in Old Swedish.
Reading the original documents.
The original documents.
Writing stuff out in runes.
For 1,500 years.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the
now it's
interesting
not
thing
LARPing anymore.
No, it's not, although they weren't speaking Hebrew until the state of Israel came into.
No, but the rabbis were reading Hebrew, studying Hebrew.
Yeah.
The reformers.
They're speaking Yiddish, though.
The reformers. The reformers went to the rabbis to learn Hebrew.
Yeah.
So this was
Calvin did. Yeah.
So there was a tradition among the Jews that went all the way back prior to Christ. The Babylonian Talmud began to be formed centuries before Christ, and it concluded sometime after Christ. And the rabbis who were teaching in that stream and tradition, there's a straight, you can say, so-and-so, they've got a better beat on it than the popes do, who goes all the way back. So culturally, it has to be way more than LARPing.
Certainly there's cultural tradition, for sure. But I would classify it much closer to that than
to the LARPing
than something that is these are the same people. So I wouldn't say that Ben Shapiro killed Jesus or anything. Right. Like I wouldn't do that because I don't think he has the same connection to those people, right? So that
and you would say the people who did have the connection were cataclysmically removed in 70 AD.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's
Solution.
Solution.
Solution, man.
Well, here's the thing. I think the main problem is the anti-Semitic problem. Let's just talk about that objectively. What your book addresses, I think that something that's not pure modernist analysis of societal influence is going on. I just think it's something deeper. So it's clearly something that's at work providentially that that I think warrants a stronger connection between people's hatred and the actual old covenant people, right? The Hagar covenant people that didn't come over, right? So I think that's there, and that is going to inform the way I go about a solution. Okay, so if it's just a matter of numbers, and there's a particular ethnic people that are really influential, all Cretans are liars, and they're impacting our society, then the solution is for substance the same, but it's going to have a different form. But I actually want to situate the problem where, like, no, there's some weird, deep hatred going on in that anti-Semitic world that is either denying that there is a connection, doesn't know that there's a connection, but there is something going on here that can only be explained by what God has revealed to us about some connection between these people and the Old Testament people. And if that indeed is the case, then you have to think through what are solutions. Of course, solutions are going to be gospel, right? It's going to be preaching Christ to them. But this is where I think Doug's solution is really instrumental, that Deuteronomic blessing. That there's Deuteronomic blessing there in the Old Testament, and are you going to classify that as some accidental part of the Old Covenant that doesn't carry over to the New Covenant? Or are you going to classify that as a substantial part of God's covenant of grace with His people, such that we're actually walking under those Deuteronomic blessings now? And I think that we are. I think it's manifest that as a nation, our own Christian nation, is immensely, remarkably, insanely blessed. And if these people that are getting hot under the collar about the Jews can remember how we're blessed, why we're blessed, and how God works covenantally, then I think a lot of the pillars are in place to deal with the anti-Semitic problem.
Understanding the Jews as the key to Christian nationalism.
So, what would you say if it's not, if it's not that, if it is, sort of a backlash to, like, Jewish left wing.
All Cretans are liars.
Yeah,
it's just so I think those guys.
So it's not necessarily a particular spiritual thing because this group is being blessed.
So my point is, I think that worldview is.
Say, what if it's not?
That worldview is insufficient. That's the problem.
Yeah.
It's like saying, the Nazis was just some natural kind of thing. You tell me, no, was there not spiritual forces at work in that particular thing? So we have to have a deeper analysis. You can't just say, well, I'm just counting up numbers, right? I'm just kind of calculating how many Jews are there in Hollywood and how many movies have they made, and it's no, something's going on here that's deeper, which I think is manifest.
Spiritual warfare, spiritual chess game behind the scenes,
right?
And the thing that I made a joke earlier about Christian nationalism, but if you have, my argument is for a mere Christendom. My son Nate doesn't like Christian nationalism. I think he wants Christian imperialism or
I'm okay with that.
Christian intergalactical. Christian intergalactical.
I like that.
At the national level, most evangelical Christians are semi-Gnostic, right? They do not think of tangible material blessings as being from God. Crops, children, abundant livestock, good drink.
Yeah.
They don't think of that as part of God's blessing of a people, right? And so one of the subtitles is the promises of Deuteronomy. And we need to, if we learn to think scripturally about how we want God's blessing in real time prior to the resurrection, prior to heaven, and we do this in covenant with God, and God pours this blessing out on us, whether the Ashkenazi Jews today are connected to the Old Testament Jews or not, they're the kind of high-performance non-Christian people that would be driven crazy. I think Paul's strategy for provoking them to jealousy was aimed at his people, his kinsmen according to the flesh. But even if they weren't his kinsmen according to the flesh anymore, it's a strategy that would work on those people, because and the anti-Semites.
So you don't think it is that God is at work, doing signs and wonders, and the Spirit is at work among the church, is the thing that is provoking them to jealousy, or what?
No, I do.
That's the same. Well, same. Oh, no, there's a distinction, not a difference, I'd say.
Yeah.
Well, I would say it depends on how you define blessing.
Okay.
So if a lot of Christians think of the blessing of God as forgiveness of sin inside, I keep my nose clean ethically at my business, and I go to heaven when I die. So the world is basically a sinking ship that we get on the lifeboat and we're taken off to heaven, or the world is God's Vietnam and we get helicoptered out before the fall of Saigon. But if you're a post-mill and you believe that the promises of Deuteronomy are going to be instantiated not just for Israel, but for all the nations of the earth, and
Christ,
and they're going to be implementing it in different ways, and the glory of the Christian gospel is going to take root in Uganda differently than it does in Finland, differently than it does in Japan, and differently than in America. So in the history of the West, the most uniquely blessed nation Deuteronomically to date has been America. We hit sort of the Powerball jackpot on the shape of our continent, the navigable rivers, the Great Plains, fertile soil,
natural resources,
the natural resources, the number of harbors up and down the east and west coast, the natural moat that we have on either side. So it was like a houses you didn't build and wells you did not dig. We won the spiritual Powerball, and we lived under those Deuteronomic blessings for a couple of centuries. It was a good run, and we were gathering steam. And then the secular apostasy happened, and we're in the process of throwing that all away. And not surprisingly, right when we start throwing it all away, this outburst of compared to Europe, America has not had a real problem with anti-Semitism.
No, never.
Comparatively. It's been odd people here and there. In Europe, it's a coal seam that runs pretty deep, and we've not been afflicted with that, but now we are. And I would say it's because we stopped living confidently and freely in Christ in such a way as to provoke Jews to envy, and now we've done the only alternative, which is to envy them instead.
Do you think, though, I mean, within that paradigm that you're presenting, do you think that, and obviously America is a unique edge for all the reasons you described, but Western Europe, I mean, France, Germany, the places that you I think rightly say it, that there's a deep strain of anti-Semitism in these countries, weren't they similarly, not to the same extent, but similarly Deuteronomically blessed?
Then they walked away.
Then they walked away first. And I would say...
But even like 600 years ago, like when Martin Luther writes his book, Germany is, or the Holy Roman Empire is massively blessed compared to the rest of the world.
They took the first initial steps out. And the thing, I'm glad you brought that up, because when Butzer and Beza were the first Reformed guys who started to emphasize a Reformed take on a special place for unbelieving Israel, believing that they're going to return. So it started very early with Calvin's successor and Butzer, and the whole history of the Reformed theologians down through the ages, down to John Murray and R.C. Sproul and everybody. They held this. It started when in Europe anti-Semitism was not did not disgrace you. You could do what Martin Luther did. And people didn't.
You didn't get canceled.
You didn't get canceled for being anti-Semitic.
No.
And in that environment where anti-Semitism could still be cool, in Europe, the genius of the prosperity that came to Europe I think, was largely Reformed. And it was within the Reformed strain that gave birth to the idea that the Jews are going to return, and that's going to be the key to world evangelization. And then when you get to the English Puritans, I would say after America, England is another Deuteronomically blessed. Like, I would say that they're number 2, silver medal, and they've been largely historically free of anti-Semitism.
Would you say the Spanish were also similarly blessed? I mean, there's massive wealth that they were able to
No, there's
gain.
a difference. I would make a
and the Inquisition was not very friendly to,
no,
to
it
Jews.
wasn't. Well, but first, and this is not a defense of the Inquisition.
Yeah.
But over the course of the whole Inquisition, about 2,000 people were killed.
Yeah.
Which was horrific and bad. All against it.
Yeah.
But
Which
that's Planned Parenthood on a slow afternoon.
Or 1 week of the French Revolution.
Right.
Yeah.
So let's put it in context.
Yeah.
Secondly, I would make a distinction between Spain, the Spanish Empire, which was rich, and England, which was wealthy.
Yeah, that's a good point. That's a fair point. Yeah.
So the Spanish found all this gold and
lying around.
Oh yeah. So they were rich, but they didn't have the manufacturing base and the farming and that sort of thing.
The cultural capital to.
They still were
to
a
make it
Mediterranean culture compared
Correct.
to
And England
Europe.
became wealthy.
Yeah.
And America became wealthier still. And then
So part of this seems like part of what you're saying is when you're living confidently as Christians and seeking to live in the blessing of God, including not just the spiritual blessings, which is the foundation, but then the earthly blessings that sort of attend it because we're still the covenant people. One of the things that enables you to do is so America sort of allowed, it was an Anglo-Protestant nation that was able to allow Catholics of a certain stripe and Jews to be basically honorary Protestants.
Yeah.
They were able to sort of tolerate and sort of for civic purposes, you can have a place here, but we're the center of gravity is in Anglo-Protestantism coming out of England,
and that held for a century.
That held for a while. But I think your point is this is the liberalism question I think as well, because then the liberalism of we're not going to persecute people who are not of our faith. We're going to have wide toleration and latitude for religious differences, and that's first denominational, and then it extends to the papist, and then it extends to the Jews. And then it's like, how far can you stretch that thing before you're just polytheistic, which is where we live now, right? Yeah. Our principled pluralism is just principled polytheism in the civic square.
Flying airplanes.
And I think what I hear you saying is part of the concern is that are there incentives for that minority people group to expand the sort of bounds of secularism
and
in
push
order
the limits.
Push the limits. And then would it be fair to say though that part of if so, granting that, right now it's biting them. Like because it seems like the Hamas stuff and the pro-Palestinian thing has been a wake-up call to a whole bunch of people who thought that this could be contained, that the CRT and everything, and I'm not saying that Jews are doing this. I'm saying just the left in general thought, hey, we can stoke this, we can carve everybody up, and we can give everybody brownie points for being different colors and sexualities and everything, and we'll be able to contain it. Yeah. And then all it took was one event in the Middle East to everybody to go, whoa, and there are bounds. And so back to solutions. The solution does seem to be something like confident Christianity. That robustly thinks, no, assume the center, where the center of gravity is Jesus Christ.
Right.
And in Jesus Christ, there's room for a certain kind of toleration, including a special toleration, I think, in your view, of Jews.
And in one of the themes or motifs that I appeal to more than once in my book is the great film Chariots of Fire, where you have the contrast between a Jewish runner and a Christian runner.
Yep.
And they're both Olympians, both at the top of their game. One runs under grace. When I run, I feel His pleasure, and the other is driven by law. It's
and envy.
It's all law and striving, and it's a wonderful, wonderful picture of what I take as the Pauline strategy for winning the world and winning the Jews, and winning the world through winning the Jews, which is a confident, gracious reception of God's good gifts. And we should all of us say, when I run, I feel his pleasure. And that's the key, I think, to everything, because that's attractive. Being angry and surly and hateful. One of the in my review of your book, I think Rod Dreher. Let's clear the record here.
Yeah, that's
Rod
right.
Dreher tagged you as being a very angry Minnesotan.
Yeah, they don't exist. Number one. Yeah.
So, which those of us who know you know that that's the opposite of what you are. But I think that we have a duty to project that freedom in Christ on the one hand, and I think we also have a duty to police the boundary of our movement, such as it is, such as the people who are filled with hatred and are overflowing are called on it. Just no, that's not what we're talking about. No, you.
I guess one question I would have for you, though, is within this the evangelistic strategy of envy, is sometimes envy produces the result that you want, that they envy what God has given you and they want to join,
right?
But also envy produces
conflict,
the opposite, and so if do you see that as a possibility of what has driven a lot of, especially the revolutionary stuff in the late 19th century,
absolutely,
and things like that. And so, so I think, don't you think it's pertinent on that end to be able to say that? And obviously, you write it in your book. But,
I would say absolutely. When people are living under the blessing of God, these Deuteronomic blessings, imagine a country. Let's just make up a country that is loving God. They're a Christian republic. They're prosperous. They're happy. They would be public enemy number one for the UN types.
Yeah.
Right. Everybody would be despising them, and so so it would draw the revolutionary blowback. And so part of the confidence is not just being confident and saying let's swagger a bit. It's not just that, but it's being confident to the extent that you're willing to push through all the hostility that's going to come your way when you start living that way.
Yeah, is part of the pushing through, though, and the confidence to be able to say, to tell things like they are, right?
Oh, yeah.
And to be able to say, well,
pornographers and brain surgeons.
Yeah, that's right.
That's telling it as it is.
Yeah, but which one has a more? I mean, is the deleterious effect of pornography greater than being able to cut out a brain tumor? Right. I think one has a much greater effect, right, on a society.
Well,
right?
We can't say that.
I don't know.
Honestly, we can't. So if someone comes up with a cure for diabetes, or something, how do you calculate how much good that has downstream? And all we have to say is, these things that they do are really, really bad, and these things are really, really good. Credit where credit is due, blame where blame is due. And so the people who say, I just want to be able to call it like it is, I would say, yes, I agree with that principle, but you're not doing it, right? Because I keep pointing your head at these good things, and you won't.
And I think the other thing would be the reactive edgelording that sort of comes as sort of, well, if we can't talk about it openly, we're going to talk about it on 4chan and sort of try to trigger everybody by doing it is just another form of reactivity.
By the way, I love these new terms like edgelord.
Yes.
It just captures.
It's old. You're a couple years behind.
I'm always a couple years behind.
Boomer.
Well, I think at the same time, though, I mean the group strategy, right? If there is at least some semi-conscious group strategy to engage in subversive activity, right? If that is a thing, right? If you grant that that's a thing.
Yeah, I hate those Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I don't think it was Anglo-Saxon, survival strategy that drove, the 20th century necessarily, but I think it was, wealthy people with political power that wanted to reshape the world according to a messed up version of postmillennialism.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, and but the flip side of that is, I don't, do you think that this ethnic identity drives people to be brain surgeons? Right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. To be proud of who they are.
Boils
and
down
things
to
like that.
Jewish mothers.
Yeah, that's right.
If Jewish mothers have those kids in violin lessons and ice skating lessons, and you're going to, you have a choice, little William. It's law school or med school. You know, it's very much a high performance culture. You will achieve. Now, I don't think Jewish mothers are trying to get their kids to be pornographers.
No,
but I do think they train and equip them, educate them, and they demand success. Right?
Do you think it's the parenting that accomplishes this?
It's the parenting in the community.
Yeah.
It's a tight, very tight community. So if you go to Brooklyn, they're as tight there as the Amish are.
Yeah.
So it's not an urban-rural thing. The Amish are very tight-knit, and the Brooklyn Jews are very tight-knit, and it's cohesive. And when you have a cohesive block like that, it keeps the knife sharp, and
you can use knives for multiple purposes.
And you can use knives for multiple things.
Yeah. So why don't Americans have things?
Because of
like
Gnosticism, semi-Gnosticism.
Okay.
Semi-Gnosticism.
Why do we have the tight knit stuff?
So with that, that's probably as good a place as any. Don't be semi-Gnostic American Christians. What's that?
We got stuff.
Oh, we got a question or two.
Be curious to hear from both Andrew and anybody. Like, what are the stakes of this, especially between the two of you? It doesn't seem like you're totally jettisoned on the other end of the spectrum. Maybe there's more overlap than not. But what do you guys see individually as the stakes?
So the question we're getting from online here is, what are the stakes of this? This debate has been somewhat it's somewhat academic, theoretical at some level, in the sense of there's a theological dimension, exegesis, but are there bigger stakes in play between whatever the difference is between how we analyze this question?
Yeah.
So the stakes, I'll do two levels. The stakes are, number one, this difference doesn't keep Andrew and me from being friends. We can be friends and talk about it. But the stakes strategically, as far as I'm concerned, is that in this moment, with the pro-Hamas people protesting and defending the most indefensible things, the right-wing tendency to come in with actually, the Ashkenazi are not really Jews, is the most massive misreading of the room I can imagine. It's like don't you see that the left tore the mask off?
Right.
The
demons are underneath, and they're just manifest.
The demons the cockroaches are running everywhere, and then right conservatives are saying we can do that, some of that too. I said, follow up this advantage.
I think I would look at the stakes a little bit differently in terms of the conversation. That if conservative evangelicals are terrified to approach these topics, then our especially our young guys who are all on the internet, they're not going to come to us to have a rational, mature conversation about these things. They're going to go to anywhere and everywhere on the internet.
That's true.
And to anyone that is not afraid to tell the truth, and so but put their spin on it. And so that, and to me, I think longer term, the next 10, 20, 30 years, that this subject will, the further away we get from the Second World War, and the more Holocaust and the Nuremberg and all of these things fade into historical memory, the more this is going to be a thing. And so I think there have to be serious, direct conversations at the risk of being canceled and being clipped on the internet saying, this guy hates Jews. But being able to say, well, there is this group here that they don't like Jesus, and many of them are left-wing, and how do we approach this as Christians, right? And not, I think back to, it was 2017, maybe 2018. There was a young man who was in an OPC church who went and was radicalized on the internet and shot a bunch of old grandmas in a synagogue. And I think about that a lot, very very often, because if I'm like, what if I was his pastor, right? What would I do differently? How would he trust me to be able to talk about the things that he's reading? And I don't want to be looked at as someone that is just going to call him an anti-Semite and say he needs to repent and yell at him, because then he's not going to listen to me and perhaps do something monstrous, right? And so, I mean, even from that extent, I want to be able to, think through these things honestly and openly, and in hopes that we can approach the topic as Christians, and so that's a big priority.
We'd be entirely in favor of open discussion of it. Yeah. You're absolutely right. If we try to bottle it up, it's going to squirt out in bad ways, sideways.
Way worse than just confronting it directly.
Well, and at the risk of stealing the show, if you want to learn how to be a sober-minded and mature leader, there's a new course on Canon Plus that just launched, I believe, today. Which
Who's starring?
It may he's a Jewish guy named Edwin Friedman.
That's
right. But seriously, like, part of the issue we're talking about is how do you deal with the world's going crazy, the world's crackling, the world's powder keg. You got the canceling, you got the scapegoating. How do you be the kind of leader that can have the conversation with the guy on the left, the guy on the right? That can be sober-minded and stable, because you're planted on a rock. You know who Jesus is, and there's a kind of gravity and a kind of gladness that you bring to the situation that's able to absorb all of the nonsense. That's what that course is all about. You can check it out at joincanonplus.com. Don't forget the books of the week: American Way by Alan Carlson and Even Exile. Beginning tomorrow, the Even Exile movie will be available for free on Twitter at Canon Press, the Canon Press Twitter account, and Doug's new book, American Milk and Honey, Anti-Semitism, The Promise of Deuteronomy, and the True Israel of God, is available now for purchase. Until next week, we'll see you then. We'll be back here with Lucille, who is still available for auction, and her cousins are available. Yes, we named her Lucille. That was Doug's idea. But her cousins are available for purchase if you'd like as well. Until next time, love Jesus, love your family, love your community, and hoist the colors high.